Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Touhou Quest, my journey through the entire mainline Touhou series. And today's title needs no introduction, Touhou 7 Perfect Cherry Blossom. In my experience of discussing Touhou over all these years and sort of researching it and talking about it with other players, even though I'm not personally a big Touhou expert, I always seem to find that when people talk about what is the best Touhou game, what are the most important Touhou games, Perfect Cherry Blossom often comes up in that conversation, and I think for good reason. It is one of the early Windows titles, and I think if you're going to introduce Touhou to a new player and kind of go over the identifying features of the series, Perfect Cherry Blossom nails almost all of them, and I think it's a great introductory title to the series of Touhou, and I think probably the way a lot of people got into the series as well. And just a lot of elements I think are quintessential Touhou, but it hasn't quite gone into the later Touhou releases like the new Touhou game that just came out, where they're doing all these different gimmicks and trying to add in these RPG mechanics and cards or whatever the hell's going on. This is still pure shmup action, which I absolutely appreciate. And just speaking of the visuals and the soundtrack, these tracks, these visuals are just really iconic, I think. And what really cemented Touhou, in my opinion, in being a popular series isn't just the fact that it was on Windows. It isn't just the fact that it has this sort of doujin aspect to it. I think the main reason why Touhou has been as popular as it has been over the years is, one, because it really boils down the shmup formula to the essentials, the core essentials that are fun, which is identifying patterns and dodging them, and sort of removing the elements of shmups that make it difficult for new players to get into the genre, in that you don't need to do a lot of enemy control. You don't need to sort of figure out routing as much. It's more about, can you identify the pattern? Can you dodge the pattern? And then Sun starts to play with this formula a little bit by having the patterns do these crazy gimmicks in different formations, and they'll start to turn and build on each other in all these cool ways. So I think it is a real shift in sort of the way the level design works that has lent to Touhou's popularity. Then on top of that, I think Zun, especially in games like Perfect Cherry Blossom, was really innovative with a lot of different ideas. For example, the background elements, as you can see in this pattern here. I think if I were to describe Touhou's design, I would absolutely say that it is very brilliant, but it was also driven by necessity, it feels like to me, where probably Zun did not have a whole lot of resources to design all these enemy sprites and all these different creatures and tanks and all the different things you tend to fight in normal arcade shmups. And he also probably didn't have the resources to build all these complex boss sprites and all that sort of thing. He was more adept, as you can see, creating characters, and so this is me projecting, but I think the design kind of shows that I'm onto something here. So he thought, okay, I can make characters, I can draw bullets, and I can make cool background effects. Let's see how far we can push these elements. And of course, he was inspired by games like Dodonpachi with the final Hibachi fight, where it's a minimal sprite but with a lot of bullets being generated. But I think Touhou takes it to the next level by not only creating more intricate bullet patterns that are interesting to look at visually, but also just the sheer amount of background play he does and visual play he does with the bullet colors, the bullet movement. He just pushes this concept to the next level, and I think Perfect Cherry Blossom is one of the finest examples of this. Though there are still elements of this game that, after I've played it quite a bit, I think do deserve a bit of critique. And I think moving forward with Touhou Quest, I'm not only going to be pointing out the parts of the games that I think are really excellent, but also parts of the games I think, this could have been improved a little bit. The one that absolutely stands out to me in Perfect Cherry Blossom, speaking of we're on stage 4 right now, is the background design of some of the stages, where he kind of forgot that there's such a thing as bullet visibility. And so there's a lot of times in this stage particularly, not yet, but later on this stage, where the bullets will blend in way too much with the background. And it is kind of interesting after spending hours and hours sort of working on my own shmup and, you know, the in-depth process that all entails, how simple Touhou games are actually in a lot of ways, but how elegantly they are put together, how he's able to pull this off, which with such simple design is absolutely impressive. For example, the bullets here, right? So Zun's bullets, the Touhou bullets, are famous because they're literally just white circles with a darker color on the outside, you know, the mainline bullet. It's very effective, but I think as he gets into the more lighter background colors, this bullet design does not work so well because that thin, darker outline will get lost in the white background. So I do think at times he could have benefited with a little bit more creativity with, maybe not creativity because he does a lot of creative stuff, but more like a little bit more care towards bullet contrasts and stuff as we get into the lighter backgrounds, which we'll talk about here shortly. So this opening section here, when I first played this stage, I was bombing it a lot because I didn't realize that he does something really interesting with bullet acceleration in this game. And I think it's a little bit more prevalent in this than Touhou 6, as far as you'll have patterns that start off flying across the speed at blazing pace, like Psycho speed almost, and then they'll start to slow down as they go across the screen. And if you're used to playing, you know, traditional arcade shmups where bullets don't accelerate or decelerate all that much, it can sort of trip you up a little bit and seem like you're gonna run into patterns of hell. And I'll point these changing speed patterns as we go. But what's interesting is he doesn't just do it with the bosses, he'll do it with some of the enemies here, especially in the later stage 5 I think it is. So this is the background that I was talking about. So it looks fantastic. And as I was going through and paying attention to this game, I noticed Zun's actually doing a lot of interesting things with the background, where he'll switch from a purely top-down perspective. Oh, here we go. I'm showing you here. And then he'll kind of spin the background into a 45-degree isometric perspective. And then he'll flatten it out again. So we had the isometric there for a second. Now he's flattened it out once again into the top-down clouds. And I really like the cloud effects. I really like what he's doing with the background. But he's forgetting, wait, the centers of the bullets are white. And those thin lines aren't that great for visibility. And so I really wish he would have also added, maybe for this stage, either dropped that background contrast a little bit so those bullets would stand out more, or given us more, maybe, I don't know, darker centered bullets, or put an extra sort of inline black core on the bullets so you could track them a little easier. That's something I've been a little bit more. See, now we're going back to the isometric. This kind of inspired me as well to think maybe in my game that I'm working on, maybe I'll start doing this with the later stages, start doing some isometric to top-down visual changes, because they're really subtle, but I think gives the game a real vibrance, or it gives it some dynamic elements to these simple backgrounds. Because like I was saying, I really get the feeling that Zun did not have the resources to create these really finessed, detailed backgrounds like Cave have, where they have amazing sprite artists going in there and really detailing out these intricate just backgrounds. So instead what he has to do is he has to get creative with, okay, I have a more minimal background element I can work with, so I'm going to start shifting the perspective, I'm going to start adding different effects on top of it. And I think this is where we get the Touhou style background spinning changes, because what he's doing is he's just trying to make the background elements of the game more dynamic without having to do too much extra art in that type of thing. And I think it really works. And I think it's a great example of clever design based on necessity. That's my own opinion anyway. So this pattern here especially can get kind of tricky to dodge, because those bullets can kind of get lost in the background a little bit. For those who actually don't know, I'm not playing this in the traditional Touhou aspect ratio. Instead, I'm using what's called Throwtator, and you can download that on, I think, the Shrine, and you can pop that in the exe folder. And what it allows you to do is allows you to play Touhou in traditional 4x3 or 3x4 tate rotation, which is really nice. And it also gives you some UI so you can see your bombs and all that still. And I just really think it should be a mainline feature of the Touhou games. And shout outs to the guy who worked on the rotator. I think it's one of the best homebrew elements of the Touhou series, and absolutely recommend if you're playing Touhou and you're an arcade game player, or just playing Touhou generally, because I think he doesn't really need that weird vertical aspect ratio. You know, he could allow for tate rotation if he really wanted to, but for some reason I guess Zun never considered doing so. I do think that's a little bit odd. Zun makes a lot of odd choices with this series, and we'll talk about those as we go on. So this bullet pattern here is what I'm kind of talking about, where it'll trip you up, because not only will it switch direction, as you're seeing there when it gets slapped, but also it will switch acceleration, which again is unusual for arcade style shmups. You know, you don't typically have bullet patterns. Maybe later cave games you start to see this, but you typically don't have bullet patterns where the bullets are not only shifting direction, but they're also shifting speed. And here we go into stage 5, which is mostly just a glorified boss fight. I remember I'm doing really good with this run. Well, it's the best one I ever did. So this character, Sakura, maybe I should talk about her a little bit. She's got a really strong wide shot, but she also has homing elements where she'll auto lock in onto things. She's just extremely good for survival. I tried all the other character ships, and I think the ships are all really, or I guess characters, all the other characters in the game, and I think they're all actually really cool. But as far as ease of 1cc, this character, it's hard to match for sure. Because Marissa, for example, I really like her movement speed and damage, but because Touhou has such a wide aspect ratio for a shmup, even though it may not seem that way, it actually is wider than most shmups. And because the enemies you fight and the bosses you fight are all these tiny little guys and girls or whatever they are, tiny little characters, it means that you don't have a lot of hitbox to land on. So when you're getting into these more complex patterns, if you're not under, it's like Hibachi, if you're not underneath the sprite, you're not doing damage. And in a lot of these patterns, you'll get pushed out into the corner. Whereas with this character here, she'll always be doing damage because she auto locks in. Same thing with the other homing types. So that is sort of a downfall of playing Marissa's. She's really good if you can get right underneath the character and just lay in the damage, but there's a lot of patterns where you're unable to do that, and so you're just stuck in the corner not doing any damage. This pattern here, I always have... Okay, so let's talk about this boss fight here. So compared to Touhou 6, I think Touhou 7, at the end there, I do a little bit of a ranking of the different metrics of the game. One of the metrics is Touhou-ness, is what I call it. And I think this begins to see a change towards Touhou-ness, where you're getting patterns that not only do they test your traditional ability to read and dodge just based on positioning and hitbox size and gaps and all that, but now Zun is starting to add in this extra dimension of new mechanics to the patterns, where the patterns will, like with this character here in a bit, will go into bullet time, or they'll speed up, or they'll start doing special mechanics. And the further and further we get into the Touhou series, the Touhou-ness rises, because Zun keeps adding more and more special mechanics to the boss fights. And then you get into the stuff like the later fan games, where you're just you have to literally know how the puzzle works, or you have to know exactly how the pattern works to even dodge it. We're not quite there yet. We're still somewhat in the realm of an arcade style gameplay experience, where you still need to be able to read the pattern and identify the gaps. You don't need to have any special knowledge of how the mechanics work necessarily. But we're kind of pushing in that direction, much more so than Touhou 6, I would say. So here we go with this bullet pattern. This one's a fun one because the way it works is, it seems simple enough, just go through the center, but then he adds in those middle daggers. And so the way to deal with that pattern is actually, as it's being launched and there's sort of gaps on the left and the right, and then that really enticing gap in the center. Naturally, you just want to go to the gap in the center, but you actually want to hang out a little bit as long as you can on the left or the right. That way you can influence the aimed knives a little bit out from the center, so that at the end, when you need to be funneled into the center, you can squeeze through without getting stabbed by those knives. So it's actually a really good example of bullet hurting and whatever you want to call it, misdirection. So here we go. The classic pattern of dodging bullets coming down from the front, but also weaving through these very slow moving bullets from the back. You'll start to see me now. I tried throughout most of the replay to not use too many bombs, not to use too many resources, but now that we're heading into these special patterns, I start to use more bombs to get out of them, just because. Okay, so let's see if I can get through the gap here. This bullet time, just because sometimes these special patterns can be a pain in the ass. So the way this works here is you get a brief sort of bullet time window, but to be a douche, I think this is clever, but to be a little stinker, what Zun does is he changes the bullet color to white. And the reason why he does that is because by making the bullets pure white like this, it actually makes them harder to read. It makes it harder to tell exactly where they're going, where they were and where they're going. That's the tricky part of that pattern, where when he slows it down and turns them white, it seems obvious, like, oh, okay, just go by the direction the bullet is pointing. But actually, it's not that simple, because the bullets have this drift to them, and if you weren't paying attention to where they were before they turned white, you won't be able to fully figure out what that drift totally looks like, or it's harder to figure that out. So that's a kind of clever mechanic to add in there. But like I said, you kind of have to know how the mechanic works to get through it a little bit easier. So this is, I would critique Perfect Cherry Blossom for this fight as well, just because this seems a little too redundant even for Touhou, because you just fought all of stage 5 is fighting this character, and then you just finished fighting this character, and then you fight her again right away in the next stage. I think Zun, it just seems really redundant. What Zun should have done is either had a different character there, or if he wanted you to fight her twice in a row, figured out a way, or twice, have a way to put her in like stage 3 or something. Space it out, because it's odd to spend an entire stage fighting her, get to the next stage, first thing you're fighting her right again. I think a little bit of a funky design there as far as just placement of the enemy, and I think it could have been solved by maybe swapping the enemies around, moving that enemy further, or maybe having that enemy a little later in this stage, like after, I don't know, somewhere. It's just odd. Anyway, or I think just have a different character, in my opinion. So again, now we're starting to land a little bit more in the Touhou camp with this pattern as well, where now you have to kind of know, oh, okay, they're going to spin around and shoot you with a searchlight, and you just kind of have to know that's going to happen, or try to react to it. So I really like this boss fight, because it is one of the few in the series where the enemy boss takes up the entire screen and is damageable from the entire screen pretty much. So if you're Marissa, you're really liking this, because you can now hit the boss wherever you are. You don't have to just follow right under and beneath the sprite. I wish Zun did more of this with Touhou, to be honest. Not just in this game, but across a lot of the other games as well, because it makes the boss fights feel more balanced, I guess you could say. It doesn't feel like you're running into the problem of getting jabbed in the corner and not being able to hit the enemy. There's a reason why most boss sprites in shmups are these big giant mechs or tanks or ships. It's because you need area to hit with your character. So there's things Zun could do in other games too, to have it so that the enemy boss takes damage across the screen, not just having them have a giant fan behind them, but he could also add in like little elements like diamonds or just whatever, floating elements that connect to the boss that you could shoot. I absolutely love this pattern. This is one of my favorite patterns in this boss fight, just because it's a little bit more classical. It feels like it's just testing your ability to quickly read bullet movement, quickly control your ship. The boss fight, though, this is one of my favorite last bosses so far in the series that I've played. I just think the patterns are all really clever and really cool. Like, here's what I was saying before with the bullet accelerations. So now they're accelerating in this kind of crazy way. Yeah, Zun's very creative. Looking back now, I mean, the thing about Touhou that's kind of tricky to review is because it's such an established series and has been so influential over all these other games, not only other fan games, but just other shmups generally. We forget that Touhou was doing a lot of interesting, unique stuff at the time, like one of them being having these kind of crazy bullet stacks and the way they unfold like that. It's all really cool. And you can definitely tell, I think Zun's talked about this before, that one aspect of his pattern design is not just the technicals of where it's pushing you on screen, where the gaps are, but he's literally sitting down and thinking, okay, is this bullet pattern pretty? Does it look nice? Is it aesthetically pleasing? There's just a strong... Touhou's like a really interesting example of visual design because there is a very strong aesthetic sense of this series, but not typically. You know, it's not like Guilty Gear where the strong aesthetic sense is obvious because just how high quality the art is and stuff like that. No, it's more like design wise, where he may not be that great at drawing things, but he's really good at adding these elements together and combining them together in visually aesthetic pleasing ways. I guess I'm trying to think of a comparison to it, maybe expressionism kind of, but with bullets and little girl characters, I guess. This pattern here always almost makes me like dizzy a little bit. The part where it goes left to right, this shift here, I don't know, it's just funky to read that. It's not complicated, but it just has this weird sort of rhythm and tilts to it that's just really funky to read. And then that last bit there where you squeeze through those bullet lines, that's all very satisfying. So there we go as far as making it through the hard mode clear. I abridge it a little bit and just start from stage 3 because the first 2 stages are kind of a snooze fest anyway. So let us get to my final thoughts and final rankings of Perfect Cherry Blossom. I would say as far as final thoughts, I liked it about as much as Touhou 6. I know it tends to be that people like Cherry Blossom more than Touhou 6, but personally, I liked them about the same. They both had things that I think did better than the other. I think Perfect Cherry Blossom has better boss fights, especially the final bosses and stuff like that. But some of the others, like Stage 5, I think is always kind of a bit of a weakness for this game. It just doesn't seem as fleshed out and well done as the later stage in like Stage 5 and number 6. And also it does feel a little bit tedious to fight these same patterns over and over and over in Stage 5, and then launch into Stage 6, and then just to troll you, have you fight them one more time. I think that was going a little far, Zun. I think he should have just added in a different character there. And then Stage 4, having the white backgrounds where the bullets are blending in a little bit too much. I wish he would have touched that up a little bit, either added some contrast to the clouds so that they weren't so white, or adding some contrasting lines or cores or something to the bullets so that they'd be easier to track across those white cloud backgrounds. But I do like the way he was shifting the perspectives from being top down to 45 degrees and stuff. I get a lot of ideas from Touhou. Whenever I'm working on my shmup, I tend to get more ideas from Touhou than other games. And like I said, the reason why is I think because a lot of Touhou's ideas are born from necessity rather than born from purely just armchair design where he thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool if I had these minimalistic backgrounds, but I added in all these transparency layers and changed the angles of the transparency layers, and then have the characters summon crazy backgrounds during patterns. I think a lot of that was born from necessity of trying to keep the game visually stimulating while not having a whole lot of resources, like raw resources to work with, like you get in cave games, for example. So I would rank this on the Touhou scale. I would give this an 7.5 out of 10 on the Touhou scale, because I know we're going to get way more Touhou-y as we go. As far as the cave scale, I'm going to give this a 7. I believe I gave Touhou 6 an 8. This one definitely still has that arcade inspiration to it. You do feel like, as an arcade player, a lot of your basic skills of reading patterns and dodging them are still very applicable. There's a little bit of stage design with the enemies and stuff like that, how you manipulate them and all that, but it's a lot more minimalistic than what you'll get obviously in a full-on arcade shmup. But still, you can still see the cave influence, absolutely. So I'm going to give it a 7 on this cave influence scale. As far as the OST, I'm going to give it a very high rating. I would say a 9. And when I give the Touhou OSTs ratings, it's just compared to each other, people. So you literally can say, oh, they're all 10 out of 10s. No, some Touhou soundtracks are better than others. But I think Perfect Cherry Blossom, again, like the visuals, like the mechanics, like the patterns, the music of this game is very iconic and feels very quintessential to the series. Like, if you're going to show someone, oh, this is Touhou music, Perfect Cherry Blossom would be one of the soundtracks you'd immediately go to. I love all the tracks. They just stand out so much, and so I'm definitely giving it high ratings. I actually used the OST of this game as background music for another game's OST, or for another game's review, and someone was able to pick it out like, oh, that's Perfect Cherry Blossom. So it definitely is distinctive. Overall, so far we're doing really well. So I really like Touhou 6. I really like Perfect Cherry Blossom. I like them about the same. I wouldn't really particularly favor one over the other, though I understand that at higher level when it comes to scoring and everything, I know Perfect Cherry Blossom is very compelling and very popular for that. So if you're into that sort of thing, getting lunatic clears and working on scoring and all that sort of stuff, no miss, no bombing, I do know that this game's very well liked in that regard as well. So thanks so much. I hope you all enjoy. I hope you all are happy that I continued this series, because I did get a lot of requests for me to do so. So up next is Touhou 8. I believe that's Imperishable Night. I don't have my Touhou dictionary on hand, but I believe that's Imperishable Night, which I'm very excited to discuss. And when I did my what shmup to start with, I actually picked Imperishable Night as the best starter shmup, and we'll see if that holds up even now. So adios. So thank you to the $5 patrons: 100, Another Joe, Anthony A, Aaron Solis, Bo, Ben, Blur Reality, Borgie22, Brian Shiver, Chris Yusufovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Climate Coyote, Cook Some Soup, Corey Mark, Des Audio, Darren Griffin, Disco Stas Leia, DJ420, Praise It, Eric H, FCK, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Hausu, J, Magellan6276, JLab, JBRPG, John Kelly, Gameboy Guru, K, K2, KZ, Khalil Reedy, Contain, Larridge, Malaise, Mark Toms, Matthew Derekish, Maz, Megadeth 859, Minung, Macklin, Michael Stum, Miguel Y, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Psycho Blizzard, Rattlecat, Raoul, Real Skeen, Riff Mason, Rolf015, Sarah, Scanline City, Seesaw FW, 7 Overdose, Shmup Junkie, Sarah Pong, Steve Fiction, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, TRM Sugumo, Twilight EX, Unikoi Roots, Wabby Legs, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.